Hi, I'm Anne E. Johnson, and welcome to a short lesson on writing dialogue in fiction. I write fiction myself, mainly speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, that sort of thing. I have a series of books called the Webrid Chronicles, which includes Green Light Delivery here, and also Blue Diamond Delivery, and perhaps more in the future. So I'm very happy that you've joined me, and this is a huge topic. We don't have a huge amount of time, but I thought I would mention some of the issues that I have thought a lot about as I've worked on my craft over the last few years. The biggest piece of advice I can give you is to make your dialogue specific to your characters. Let what they say help to define them for the reader. The words can show their attitude toward life. It can show their level of education. It can show how they relate to other people. There's an interesting technique that is used in screenwriting and in the TV industry, where after this is all groupthink, of course. These big scripts are made by groups of people, but after a group has agreed on a script, then certain people are assigned to go through the script and redo it, adding in specific points for a particular character to bring out this person's grumpiness or that person's sarcasm, things like that. And it's not a bad technique to use in writing fiction as well, when you're on your umpteenth draft, to go through and make sure each thing that each character says is right for that character. But we're getting ahead of ourselves because that assumes that you've written the dialogue to begin with and are just tweaking it. So, some things to think about as you write. I assumed when I started writing fiction that the best dialogue would be the most natural sounding dialogue. But I quickly found that natural, as in how people actually speak, is not the kind of dialogue that works best when you read it, or for that matter, when you hear it in a play or in a movie. Because go out and listen to some people talk. I do this every day. I go to a coffee shop to write, and I listen to the conversations around me, and I'm always stunned by how poorly everybody speaks. We are inefficient speakers, even those of us who think about what we're saying as we say it, and as I'm sure you will agree, most people don't think about what they're saying as they say it. So what you want is a natural sound that is actually carefully controlled. The idea of controlling language so it has a particular color is a science that dates from the 16th century. It was a type of poetics, that is the study of language, in Italy, started by a man named Cardinal Pietro Bembo, and this movement that he started for improving Italian poetic language goes under the wonderful name of Bembismo. So we're all practicing Bembismo here. Bembo realized that language and also the topics that you choose to write about have particular moods. So there are some sweet or sweetly sad, bittersweet moods, and then there are the serious, dark, heavy moods. So the first he called piacevolezza, and the second he called gravità. And these are old ideas, but they are true. They are true of any language that you're working in and any type of writing that you're doing. Let me give you a few examples of how this might work in English, modern English dialogue, some very simple examples. Let's say we have two characters, Jasper and Mindy, and we're trying to learn a little more about Mindy. It's a super short conversation that I think can tell us a lot. So in example 1, we have Jasper speaking to Mindy. He says, "How is your mother?" Jasper asked. Mindy paused before answering. She passed on. By listening to just that short example, we can tell that Mindy is probably sad, she's thoughtful, she takes a moment to think about her answer, and she uses what Bembo would have called gravitas language in her answer. She passed on. These are words with open vowels that use the whole palate. And as you read, yes, you hear the words in your head, so it does matter how you might form the words. It doesn't matter that this isn't a play. You'll still hear the words as you read them. This might give the sense that she's a spiritual person. That same conversation could be done in a different way. Here's example 2. "How is your mother?" Jasper asked. "She died," said Mindy. Here we're given no extraneous information. She simply answers. Straight ahead, you can't say she died any more simply than just she died. And there's no special tag or information about how she answers. But still, the reader can infer some things from this. For example, that perhaps Mindy is practical, or Mindy was expecting this, or she doesn't want to talk about it, just wants to get the answer over with and move on. So a lack of words in dialogue does not necessarily give less information. And then the third example is a more comic approach to the same conversation. Again, we'll learn a lot about the characters and also the author. So the third example is, "How is your mother?" Jasper asked. "Finally kicked the bucket." Here Mindy has no tag, that is, her name isn't on this at all, which can give a little bit more emphasis to a piece of dialogue. We'll talk more about the concept of tagging in a moment. But it's also her language, her very bright-sounding, irreverent language that uses hard consonants and short vowels. "Finally kicked the bucket." Very different sound, completely opposite from "she passed away," which was the first example. So this is the sort of thing you must keep in mind, that your reader, you have to assume that your reader understands the concept of colloquialism and connotation in language, that specific ways of saying things mean things, but also that your reader hears as she reads. While we're on the topic of colloquialism, I want to speak for a moment about slang. Slang can be a wonderful way to identify a character's background, or identify the region or time where a story takes place. It can be a great comic tool. But you have to be very careful with it, because if you use too much slang, you might end up with something that slows the reader down. Remember that reading, for most people, is faster than speech. So if you write slang that is so intricate and so far from the standard norm of English, you might cause your reader to stumble and need to figure out what your words say, and you never want that. Not if you're writing dialogue so that it's supposed to bring the story along. There are types of writing where you want the reader to sit and think about the language itself. That's its own sort of writing. But that's really not what we're talking about here. We're talking about using dialogue as a support for storytelling. So I want to read an example that is just at the precipice. It is just at the edge of being too much slang, and it's from the great master of writing slang in American English, Raymond Chandler. This is from Farewell, My Lovely. Where we are in the plot doesn't particularly matter. You'll see what I mean. Things to listen to here are words he's left out. Jargon that would only be understood by people of a certain set in West Coast America at a certain time in history. And also a sound of irreverence in the use of this language. So you have a shifty character, let's say, who's discussing with someone else the possible suspect for a crime that's been committed. Of course, it's Chandler, so that's not a surprising setup for this dialogue. All right, so here's the dialogue. Guy in loud clothes, as big as a house. He come in a car too, but the old lady don't get the license, can't remember the number that far off. This was about an hour after you was there, she says. He goes in fast and is in about 5 minutes only. Just before he gets back in his car, he takes a big gat out and spins the chamber. I guess that's what the old lady saw he done. That's why she calls up. She don't hear no shots, though, inside the house. So if you spoke like that to someone on the street today, they would think you were crazy, or maybe a Raymond Chandler fan. But I think one of the most important things about that is it's got just enough grammatical issues, problems, mistakes actually, to make you know the background of this person, guess at it, but few enough that you can still follow what's going on. It's a tricky balance. Another thing to think about, which we did not have here because that was just one speech, is how you get from one line of dialogue to another. And this is the issue of tags or attributions. So, he said, she said, he bellowed, she cried, he shouted. All of these things, they're all useful. You can get into more specific ones, but you have to be very careful. The tag can slow the reader down, and it can detract from the dialogue itself. So a general rule of thumb is to use said almost always, unless there is a really specific reason why the delivery of the dialogue matters. That is, if there is a roaring engine, it might be worth saying he shouted. If they are sneaking up on somebody, it might be worth saying she whispered. But generally speaking, keep it unobtrusive by using the word said, or by using nothing at all. So you could replace a tag with a sentence. Something like, I think we should come home earlier tomorrow. He looked at her and grinned. So we know who said it, but we also at the same time get a little bit more information, knowing what he did with his face, get a little bit of clue of his emotion when he said it, and that can be done with an action sentence before or after the dialogue. Or you could have no tag and no action sentence at all, as long as there are only two people speaking. I've edited some things where there are long dialogues between two people with no attributions at all, and you have to flag those, because a few lines of that is okay. Your reader can deal with it. He said, she said, he, and just put that information in. But if it gets very long, forget it. Your reader's going to lose track. And of course, if a third person is involved, you cannot have no attributions. It's just too confusing for the reader. I wanted to read another example here. One thing that editors get very up in arms about is the use of adverbs on tags. He asked nervously. She said timidly. He demanded angrily. These things, which could be done as adverbial phrases instead. He asked with a nervous grin, that sort of thing. But you have to be very careful with that, because the fact is the dialogue itself should be conveying what these people are feeling. So it's usually a sign of weakness, and think of this as you're editing your own work in your umpteenth draft. Think, okay, do I need this adverb, or is this a sign of weakness in the dialogue? Often it is, and you need to tweak the dialogue slightly so you can take out that adverb. I wanted to read you this example. This is from one of my favorite novels of all time, Inside Mr. Enderby by Anthony Burgess. And he was a writer who was always aware of the conventions and the problems of writing. He has a very self-conscious style, which I don't think many people can pull off, but for my taste at least, he certainly does, and I find him hilarious. He does here a sort of parody of the issue of the adverb on the tag. And instead of using the adverb to describe how the character is speaking, he replaces it with an adjective to describe the character. So Enderby in this novel is a poet, and he is also a misanthrope, and he's been invited to come and read his poetry and get an award by some organization, which he really doesn't want to do, and he's ignored the invitation, but he runs into the patron who invited him, and he's very embarrassed, and she's cornered him, and he has to make up some excuse, namely that he didn't get the letter. So this is how Anthony Burgess handles that situation. "Yes," said flustered Enderby. "Oh yes, I would, but perhaps that was forwarded by them to my old address, because I'd forgotten to tell them about my new address, and also, for that matter, the post office. Checks," said babbling Enderby, "are normally paid straight into my bank. I don't know why I'm telling you all this. I'm terribly sorry," said humble Enderby. "That may explain why I never got it." So it's this is sort of one of those don't try this at home situations, but it's a fun reminder of how it doesn't have to be an adverb. There are other ways to approach the tag to give a little bit more information if you need to. All right. There is one more issue that I want to deal with, and that is the use of narration. Narration around dialogue can be useful for setting it up, but on the other hand, it can also be disruptive. And sometimes telling the reader what's going on as a conversation is happening, can keep the reader from getting the highest impact out of the conversation. And I want to read one more quick example. This is from a novel called Sexing the Cherry by Jeanette Winterson. And in this, I don't need to tell you much because you can tell so much by how she sets up this conversation. She has narration at the beginning, and then bits of conversation without any narration or tags at all. And from that, you learn a great deal about these characters and their situation. So, it starts with narration. "We had been married a few years when a man came to the door selling brushes. My husband was at work, so I let the man into our kitchen and gave him something to eat. I asked him to show me his bag, and he spread out, as you would imagine, a layer of polishing cloths, a pile of round soaps, combs for the hair, combs for the beard of a billy goat, ordinary household things. I bought one or two useful pieces, then I asked him what he had in his other bag, the one he hadn't opened. 'What was it you wanted?' he asked. 'Poison.' 'Yes, for rats?' 'No, for my husband.'" So just from that little exchange, you know everything you need to know about this character and what she's planning and what her life is probably like. All right, there's so much more one could say about this topic, but the thing to remember is you will write your best dialogue if you never lose sight of your reader, and if you allow yourself to think like your characters as you write, as a playwright would need to as well. Yes, these are characters who've never existed before, and But that doesn't matter. It's a wondrous thing about writing fiction is that your characters are in you somehow, and your job is to release them. And if you're doing it right, they will amaze you, and they will surprise you, and they will delight your readers. Thank you very much for joining me. Please feel free to leave comments or questions in the comment section, and do visit me if you can at anneejohnson.com and check out some of my short stories and books. Thank you very much.